Chapter 6. The Shrike to Your Sharp and Glorious Thorn. George watched them from across the room, a silent observer to their grim affair. They stood over the kitchen table, their heads bent together, murmuring in quiet tones. Across the table's surface was a spread of maps and books opened to pages that had turned brown with age. Once in a while, Sapnap would say something that would make Dream frown and flip furiously through one of the books, pointing roughly to a passage that would make Sapnap's cheeks turn red with embarrassment. And then Sapnap would glance up at George, and George would see something like an accusation in his eyes before he looked away again, back to the one thing he had always been made to do. It should not have been a surprise that the god of war would be so quick to plan it, but still George watched, and waited, and judged quietly. It was supposed to be an easy choice to make. An angel of death was coming after Dream, and Dream was their friend, so they had to protect him. "We'll come for him first," Dream had said, and Sapnap had agreed so quickly, even as Dream's fingers dug bloody indents into the skin of George's wrist. And George had almost fallen for it too. He'd almost replied, "I'd do anything for you." He feared that if he'd said the words out loud, he might have meant them. He was afraid of this strange loyalty to Dream. It had come so quickly, too quickly, and too much. There was no explanation for it, no rationality. Was this what devotion meant? A blind and desperate obedience? Did all friendships feel so all-consuming to the point that it would be death to let go? Did all the poets lie about it being easy? "George?" George lifted his eyes, found Sapnap staring at him with worry. No, George thought. The poets didn't lie. Not about him. "What?" George scoffed, raising an eyebrow and crossing his arms over his chest. "Glad to see you still remembered I was here." "I didn't forget," Sapnap said. "Come over here, Dream needs your opinion on something." George walked cautiously over to their makeshift round table. He had to tiptoe around all the other things they'd filled their small kitchen with. They'd always meant to organize. Every now and then they'd look around the floor strewn with discarded trinkets and stacks of books, both stolen and bought, and one of them would say, "We should clean up a bit." And the other two would nod, and by nightfall they'd all have forgotten the exchange. George thought it was because they'd always had the promise of a later date, of more time to sort through the evidence of their shared life, of a future, far-off day where they could sit down and do something as mundane as spring cleaning. And now they were starting a war against an immortal angel. George thought that may take precedence over a messy kitchen. He found himself by Sapnap's side, looking down at a map covered with Dream and Sapnap's handwriting. The man coming after Dream was once the ruler of a kingdom in the south. George had heard of it in passing, once or twice. They said it was a peaceful kingdom, with a peaceful king. It had not seen war in decades. A few years ago, maybe 2, he'd heard of the Queen's untimely passing, and the past king's sudden disappearance. Their heir had been crowned, too young, and in the wake of the loss of both of his parents. George had sympathized with him, just a little bit. And now Dream was saying the king's lost father, the angel of death, was coming for a vengeance long overdue, and his kingdom would pay the price for it. George traced the broken lines that marked the kingdom's borders, the small stars that marked its towns and cities. These poor people, George thought, with an unfamiliar pang of pity. They have no idea what's coming. "What do you need me for?" he asked Dream. Dream ran his fingers through his hair as he considered the map before them. "Where will you be strongest?" "What?" A look of annoyance crossed Dream's face as he repeated his question. "Where will you be strongest? Which of the forests will listen to you? What the hell are you talking about?" "I'm taking stock of our assets, George. I need to know where you'll thrive as a fighter. Here?" Dream tapped a finger against a large portion of the map, marked with a crude drawing of trees. This is the largest of their forest land. You can do a hell of a lot of damage there. Sapnap's good everywhere, but your use to me fluctuates with the area, doesn't it? You'd be useless in northern battles. George stared at him for a long beat. And then he said, "You're terrified." Dream blinked slowly at him. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice laced with a subtle warning. Since the moment he'd let go of George's wrist and stomped back into the community house, wild-eyed with ideas about how to make his one shot hurt, he had not stopped feeling like a powder keg about to explode. George's sense of self-preservation told him to step back before he cut himself on Dream's sharp edges, but instead he said, "You don't think you can win this, can you? Don't be stupid. Just tell me where you can help me best. You wouldn't be asking that if you were confident you could do this. All those other wars we did, you didn't even think about it. You threw us into the thick of it without all this strategy nonsense, because you didn't have anything to be afraid of then, but this is different." George didn't flinch at Dream's glare. "What's your plan again, Dream?" "Come on," Sapnap said. "We don't have to do this right now." But Dream only ignored him. To George's question, he said, "Hit him where it hurts. Make him come running back to save his little country. Shove a sword through his heart and then be back home in time for dinner." "Well, see, that's the problem, Dream. You sound nonchalant enough, but this—" George gestured to the mess of maps, to the little wooden soldiers that stood for the armies he planned to raise. "This isn't what a nonchalant person does. You're like a child throwing a tantrum to get his father's attention. But what will you do the moment he turns around, Dream? You don't seem ready for that." "You don't understand," Dream said, his green eyes bright with an anger barely held back. "You think this is some silly grudge? You think this is a spur-of-the-moment thing? You think this hasn't been eons in the making?" He stepped forward until he towered over George, his face clouded. "You don't know anything about me and him. This isn't a tantrum, George. This is me throwing the chessboard away before he can call checkmate." When George didn't step back, Dream's expression softened into something kinder and easier to trust. "This is beyond you. I wouldn't expect you to understand, but you will someday. Maybe before this all ends, I'll tell you the whole truth of it. Him and me, and the fucked up game we've been playing before you even existed. Maybe you won't forgive me for it now, but you'll learn. And an unsaid promise after that, I'll teach you." The silence stretched, infinite and heavy. And then George asked, his voice like a stranger's, "Who do you think you are?" Dream pointed back to the map and said, "Just tell me where you can be of use." At that, George scoffed, spun on his heels, and walked away. It was a miracle that he could still walk away from them. Over the years it had gotten increasingly difficult. They'd grown around him like ivy around a tree, and to leave was to remove a part of himself that he could never get back. And to think, once upon a time, he'd gone his whole life without needing anyone. Now all there was need. George hated it. He hated it more than anything. Everything on him wasn't his alone. It was Sapnap's cloak around his shoulders. His boots were a gift from Dream. Strip all that away and what would be left? He was no one without them. No one and nothing. George blinked and found himself on the roof of the community house. He didn't recall the climb, but there he was, his knees drawn to his chin and the scarlet dusk falling around him. The forest was alive with the screaming of 1,000 cicadas, announcing the inevitable night. George shook his head once, and they all fell quiet, all at once. The forest was his. That was something no one could take away. By the time Sapnap found him, it was well into the night. "Took you long enough," said George, trying not to sound bitter. "You know, there was a time once when you would have been right behind me." "We had to finish planning," Sapnap said, defensively. You know, George, sometimes you aren't the center of the universe. George rolled his eyes. I don't care about the universe. I care about why exactly it seems like I'm the only one who thinks this is a bad idea. We've always had bad ideas, George. Never stopped us from doing them anyway. This is different. You can't pretend it isn't. Dream is different. When George glanced sideways at Sapnap, he was surprised to find him angry. He leaned back on his hands, his jaw set and his shoulders tense, and George thought, what the hell did I do? How'd we get here? Sapnap said quietly, looking up into the darkening sky. I thought it was always us three against anything. That was the deal, George. Sapnap, it's just what, George? At that, Sapnap finally looked at him, his dark eyes like burnt-out charcoal. Just that you're scared? You can say it. You can say you don't want to fight, that this one's too big for you. I won't blame you. Just say you're a coward and stop blaming us for it. George drew in a sharp breath. The look of surprise on Sapnap's face made it clear that even he had not expected to say what he'd said. Or, at least, that he had not meant to say it out loud. Why? George asked. Why do you want to throw yourself into this with him so badly? Because he's my friend, Sapnap said simply, like that was truly all that mattered to him. I do it for you too. The difference is I wouldn't ask you to. George shook his head. If this angel of death ends up being the end of you, just don't forget I told you so. George, Sapnap said. And this time, he sounded a bit like the Sapnap George knew. Come on, have a little faith in me. I have nothing but faith in you, Sapnap. It's Dream I'm worried about. He was scared Dream wouldn't know when to stop, and that Dream would throw everything he had at this, without caring where they landed. He'd break himself against this war of his, and George didn't want to be close enough to get caught in the aftermath. Absently, he reached for his wrist, the one Dream had held so tightly he'd felt his bones scream. He ran his fingers where Dream's nails had punctured his skin. He wasn't surprised to find faint scars already forming in the shape of 4 crescent moons. He said he'd throw the whole board away if he couldn't win, George said. He'd do it, even if we were still on it. Sapnap blinked, and it looked like he was waking up from a long, long dream. Do you think we're just pawns to him? Sapnap asked quietly. George faced him fully. When it came down to it, if he tossed me to the wolves, Sapnap, would you still take his side? Sapnap looked stricken. He wouldn't do that. But he sounded unsure. If he did, I'd... He took a deep breath, and the next words out of his mouth were grounded in something deeper than his loyalty to Dream. I'd kill him. This war of his, Sapnap, George said. It'll be the end of us. I don't know why I know that, but I believe it. I believe it down to my bones. And I'm not ready to lose you just yet. Below them, Spirit grazed quietly. He was old now, older than a wild horse usually lived. George didn't know who was keeping him alive, George or Dream or Spirit himself. But he was glad for the familiarity of Spirit's shadow slanting over the grass in front of the house. They watched him in silence for a long while, and then Sapnap stood. I'll talk to him, Sapnap said resolutely, looking over the home they'd built together. Maybe I can get him to reconsider. I'll make him leave you out of it if that's what you really want. He nodded, almost to himself. I'll make him change his mind, all right? Oh, foolish little war god. He really did think he had that kind of power. That was the tragic part. Okay, George said quietly, putting his life in Sapnap's hands, as he had done 1,000,000 times before. I'll be here. Sapnap nodded again, and then he turned to make his way down from the roof. At the roof's edge, he glanced back at George. Hey, he said. It's all going to be okay. We'll laugh about this someday, just you wait. George didn't say anything back. If he'd known it was the last time he'd get a chance to talk to Sapnap before everything fell apart, he would have. He would have said, "Don't leave me." He would have said, "Don't make me go back to who I was before you." He would have said, "Please, please, please don't leave me alone with him." He would have said anything to get him to stay. But, as it was, the next thing George heard was a distant crash, a single shout. Instinct kicked him and called him back to Dream's side. He slid from the roof and hit the ground hard. Spirit was nowhere to be seen, so George threw the door to the community house open and ran inside, his heart already broken, already mourning, as if something had warned it in advance of what he would see around the corner. "Dream?" George called out as he stumbled back into the kitchen and found chaos. And, as always, he found Dream at its center. "George," Dream said softly. "He took Spirit." Dream sat with his knees pressed to the ground, like someone in prayer. Around him, the kitchen had been torn apart. A stack of books had been so violently kicked toward the corner where George had been standing just an hour before, their pages had all been torn from their covers. The kitchen table they'd all bent their heads over had splintered down the middle. And the crash that George heard had been his mirror, once hanging proudly in the hallway, now laying in 100 shattered fragments across the kitchen floor. Light bounced off them in 1,000 different directions, and in a different time, George might have found it beautiful, like he was standing in a shower of starlight. But at the sight of blood mixed in with the glass, George only had room for fear. There was a cut on Dream's cheek, freely bleeding. "Did Sapnap do that?" George asked quietly, afraid of the answer he already knew. Dream stared up at him, breathing heavily. He offered George his hand, and George, without knowing why, took it. Dream pulled him down to the floor with him. Broken glass dug into George's knees, but he didn't try to stand up. "He's gone, George," Dream said. "He said his piece, and then ran away when he couldn't get his way." George was shaking his head before Dream could even finish his sentence. "Sapnap wouldn't do that," he said. "He wouldn't. Not to me. Dream, what the hell did you say to him?" Dream's eyes flashed dangerously. "You think I drove him away? You think I didn't try to get him to stay? I think Sapnap wouldn't just leave," George snapped. "What the hell happened?" Dream barked out a bitter laugh. "You tell me, George. What the fuck did you say to him?" George drew back. "You think this is my fault somehow?" "Sapnap never acts out, not unless it concerns you. Don't talk about him like he's some damn dog." "What did you tell him this time, George?" Dream asked, and the room around them blurred around the edges. It was hard to focus on anything that wasn't the angry fire in Dream's eyes, or his grip on George's wrist, pressing deep again, burning him. Because whatever it was, George, it was enough to chase him out of here. "I didn't..." George choked on his own words. Something inside him had cracked right down the middle. "I didn't tell him to leave. I told him to choose the safest choice for us. For me." There was only pity on Dream's face. "George," he said, "there's no difference." George watched the blood trickle down Dream's cheek and drip down to the floor between them. It was always going to end in blood and broken glass. That was how their story was written. There would be no happy endings, not for people like them. They'd done too much against the universe to expect a reward now. Wherever good souls went, George and Dream and Sapnap would go the opposite direction. So, this pain was deserved. This grief was inevitable. He was always going to suffer. He just thought Sapnap would be here to carry half the heartache. "He wouldn't leave me," George repeated, numb to everything but Dream's grip on his hand. It was his only anchor to a world that had suddenly turned unrecognizable. Up was down, north was west, and Sapnap had left George without a goodbye. He wouldn't just leave me like that. Dream, the boy in the snow, then the boy in the river, and now the boy kneeling beside him while the rest of the universe burned around them, sighed and said, "George, oh George." He just did. He tried to go after him. If George wanted Sapnap to know one thing, that would be it. He tried. The morning after, he'd packed a bag, fully intending to follow the divots Spirit's hooves had made on the pliant dirt. He'd followed it all the way to the edge of the forest. And then George had turned back. He'd gone back to the house, exhausted beyond explanation, and sat on the grass outside, all alone until Dream found him. Dream sat down beside him, and they were both silent. The next day, George stood and started walking again. But always, he stopped at the very edge before retracing his steps. And always, Dream would be waiting on the grass, his legs tucked under his chin, watching George approach with an indecipherable look in his eyes. The 5th time it happened, George sat down beside him and said, "Ask me." Dream blinked curiously at him. "Ask you what?" "Ask me the question that you've been wanting to ask me this whole time." Dream looked as if he was considering playing dumb, but both of them were past the point of pretending he wasn't 2 steps ahead of everyone else. "Why don't you leave?" It was a fair question. It should have had an easy answer. After all, George had his favorite, and both of them knew it wasn't Dream. Sapnap was his best friend, his longest friend. Where Sapnap went, George wouldn't be too far behind. And yet, Sapnap had left, and hadn't dignified him with a goodbye or an explanation. He'd left, and he'd taken their horse with him. He'd left, and George wasn't going after him. "Is it a matter of pride?" Dream asked. "Of winning? You go after him, you lose. He comes groveling back, you win." "It's a matter of faith," George said simply. "I have to stay, for when he returns." "Faith?" It was the first time George had ever caught Dream by surprise. "You still have faith?" George traced his fingers against the cold ground beneath him, growing pure white daisies in the wake of his touch. "It's all I have left." Strangely, it was Dream who broke first. George was more used to waiting. After all, he'd spent a handful of centuries waiting for the world to suit him, sleeping years away without much thought. And he was more used to Sapnap's tantrums, too. He was sure Sapnap was going to burn himself out soon and come back with a begrudging apology, but until then, George was going to find worthwhile distractions. He started with their broken kitchen. He found a broom and swept up the broken glass, ignoring the blood stains on the floor. He threw out everything that had broken and splintered, stacked the salvageable books into neat stacks, took the map with Dream and Sapnap's handwriting scrawled across its surface and folded it into a tidy square. Dream wouldn't need it anymore. His plans for war had grinded to a halt the moment Sapnap left. George could see it, the disappointment in his eyes whenever he looked at George, thinking something George already knew. He couldn't do anything with just George. He needed Sapnap. So, 6 months after Sapnap had disappeared, they found themselves sitting around the dining table George had fixed. It hadn't been easy. Even now, he thought he could still feel the splinters he'd earned for his troubles. But at least there was somewhere to sit now. Somewhere where they could still pretend they were still waiting for someone. George sat at one end of the table, pretending to read. Dream sat across from him, watching him pretend. In between them, a 3rd chair sat empty. George had already reread a sentence thrice without understanding a single word before Dream stood so suddenly his chair clattered backwards behind him. George peered over his book at him, only to find Dream staring at him with an intensity that made George glad there was a whole table between them. "What?" he asked, trying to sound unperturbed. "Let's go," Dream said simply. And then he was striding out of the kitchen. George blinked, finding himself alone in a room once filled with 3 different voices laughing. He had nothing left to do. He folded the edge of the page he'd been reading, already knowing even then that he'd never get the chance to finish it. And then he followed Dream. He found Dream crouched at the threshold, already lacing up his boots. He stood and turned to toss George's cloak at him. "Where are we going?" he asked, even as he tied his cloak obediently over his shoulders. Dream's face was unreadable. "We're getting our little soldier back." The forest was quiet as they made their way out of it, as if in solemn mourning. Not even the cicadas seemed to care that it was nightfall. When George passed the last tree at the very edge, he felt as if the forest was the one that left him, instead of the other way around. But he put one foot in front of the other, his eyes fixed on Dream's back, the curl of his sunburned hair, almost silver in the moonlight. "I'll follow you anywhere," George thought again, helplessly, anguishing, to my bitter end. The voice in his head was his. The words were not. He could see the truth forming, terrible and cruel, but inevitable. And still, he followed each of Dream's footsteps, because he was running on faith, but faith wasn't going to be enough this time. Dream needed sapnap, but so did George. He just wanted his best friend back. Dream suddenly stopped in the middle of the road. A few paces behind him, George stopped too. Dream raised his hand, and before long, 2 shadows were heading straight towards them. As they approached, George saw them more clearly. It was 2 people on horses. Sharp neighs pierced the night air as their riders pulled sharply on their reins, stopping right in front of Dream. The riders jumped down from their horses with a quiet thud. One of them, wordlessly, handed his horse's reins to Dream. The other gave his to George. In the dark, with their hoods pulled over their faces, it was hard to be sure, but George thought the riders looked half asleep. Dream was already on his horse, looking down at George and the riders, who stood silently where they were. He cocked his head to the side, as if asking, "Well?" George looked down at the rein in his hands. "How do you know where he is?" he asked, rather belatedly. Dream scoffed, as if the question was an insult. "Don't be stupid, George," he said, which wasn't really an answer. "Get on the horse." So George pulled himself up on the horse that had been quite literally handed to him. And then they were riding into the night, leaving the riders behind in the dust off their own horses. They rode in silence for a long while, following the moon as it arced across the cloud-choked sky. But the questions were only building inside George, and he had no choice but to let one out before he exploded with them. "Who are those people?" he shouted into the wind. Dream didn't even glance back at him. "Very generous folk." "How do you know them?" "I know a lot of people, George." "And they're okay with you just stealing their horses?" Dream shrugged, and then snapped his reins, pushing his horse forwards. The conversation was over, because Dream decided it was. It was a fact that George was starting to accept. The road spread out before them, a straight, unforgiving lineup until the horizon, where it branched off into different paths like the spindly arms of a spiderweb. Only Dream knew the way. They said nothing else. And they rode on. They found the camp just as the moon slipped behind the gathering storm clouds, and as they stood on a hill overlooking the tents scattered across the valley below, George felt a memory pulled violently out of him. The last time he'd found sapnap in a camp like this, he'd been a prisoner. Now, standing beside Dream, he didn't feel any different. "This is..." George began, then shook his head. "Why would he be here?" Dream's smile was sharp and mirthless. Leave it to a war god to find solace in war. He made his way down the hill, then looked over his shoulder when he realized George wasn't right behind him. What are you waiting for? The wind was howling, lifting George's hair and his cloak. His shadow behind him looked like it had very errant wings. Below him, somewhere in that mess of tents and torchlight and soldiers preparing for battle, was someone who'd broken his heart without even trying. Suddenly, in a moment of sharp clarity, George thought about running. He thought about getting back on his horse and going back home, wherever that was now. He thought about finding himself a nice, cold cave in a nice, quiet forest and going back to sleep. He thought about forgetting. Because, gods damn it, the past 6 months had been unbearable. It felt like someone had cut him in half, and he operated only as a fraction of who he used to be. He wasn't sure he wanted to go down there, find Sapnap and give him that power over him again. He wasn't sure if Sapnap deserved it. But he had to know. He had to know why. I'm coming, he told Dream. They walked, side by side, into the camp. George expected aggression, or, at the very least, suspicion. The two of them in their dusty cloaks stuck out like a sore thumb. But there were no demands to identify themselves, no soldier dragging them off to be interrogated. They moved unobstructed, almost invisible through the ranks. The soldiers were laughing, talking, sharpening their swords, counting their arrows, hurrying to dinner. George and Dream might as well be ghosts. They made their phantom procession, down the rows and rows and rows of tents, preparing for a war. Always another war with these mortals. George didn't even know which war this was, or which kingdoms it was between, just that it was new, and it would end as all wars did. Brutally, without real victors, only to make way for another one, down the rows of tents again until the campfire, at the heart of the camp, the burning light to which every insignificant insect flocked. George saw him first. He was sitting near the fire, his sword lying beside him, never far from his side. A white cloak was thrown over his shoulders, the same one all the other soldiers were wearing. It should have made him indistinguishable from the rest, but there was no hiding what he was. He was a warrior among men. They could not hope to win without him. And despite everything, George couldn't help but relish in their shared divinity. They were gods. They would always be gods. This, and everything, was beneath them. No matter what grew between them now, time, anger, betrayal, they would always have their immortality. At the end of time, it would still be the three of them together. Sap, George began. Nap. A different voice finished. George blinked, and in an instant, Sapnap wasn't alone. There were 3 people by the fire now. Someone had their arm around Sapnap's shoulders, jostling him in that way that George knew he didn't like. But Sapnap was laughing. As Dream and George looked on, Sapnap leaned against the other person who had joined him, and they laughed, all 3 of them, together. And George wanted to know what the hell was so funny, because he'd never heard Sapnap laugh like that. Not in 100 fucking years. Oh, Dream breathed. He's replaced us, George. But that wasn't quite true. Replacement would imply that 2 things had equal value. But the smile Sapnap had on his firelit face now, that was a smile George had never seen him wear. While George was fixing the mess he'd left behind, while George was doing everything and anything to distract himself from the grief of being the one left behind, while George kept whatever faith he still had left alive through whatever means, while George was stuck with someone he no longer recognized, Sapnap was building a life where he felt safe enough to laugh like nobody was watching. He didn't replace them. He outgrew them. A small, traitorous voice in his head told him to march up there, to demand answers, To throw the tantrum Sapnap always accused him of. To show him what a tantrum really looked like. To fill this whole valley with poison ivy, to smother them all in vines. To remind Sapnap how easily he could take it all away from him. George's heart froze. What, he thought, the hell am I thinking? He could feel Dream's eyes on him. Always. George ran. He didn't stop running until he found the cliff. It was miles away from the valley and the camp, miles away from the nearest road, miles away from anyone else. He ran towards the edge, towards the open sky, towards the infinite darkness below, and then he stopped, and he screamed, and the first clap of thunder served as his echo. The sky broke apart above him, spilling an ocean's worth of rain. Another boom of thunder. Another scream. Was it rain, or was it tears now? George no longer cared. He no longer knew enough about himself to care. Who was he supposed to be now, knowing what he didn't want to know about Dream? Who was he supposed to be now, without Sapnap? Who was he supposed to be without them? Who was he? Because whoever he was at this moment, he didn't think it was himself. He'd never felt this anger before, not even when the mortals first burned a forest down and he'd felt the fear of creatures trapped in the smoke. It was anger beyond anger. It was fury. If he still had his mirror, if he looked at himself now, he'd see the same look in his eyes as he'd seen in dreams, that day he told them about the angel, that day that changed everything. This fury didn't belong to George. But still, here he was, carrying it, feeding it, nurturing it. If Dream asked him to join a war now, he would say yes, and he could win it alone. He'd be a solitary Shrike, impaling Dream's enemies on thorns of his own making. He would not let anyone on that battlefield forget what he was. He'd do anything, just to give this anger in him somewhere to go. When he heard footsteps behind him, he thought it would be Dream, coming to collect on the promises he'd made inside his head. But it was someone he dreaded more. "George," Sapnap said. "What the hell did he do to you?" George spun, and saw his face in the brief flash of lightning before the thunder followed. He was looking at George like he was some wounded animal he either had to rescue or put down. George barked out a laugh. It filled his lungs with cold rainwater. "The things we do to each other," George sighed. "How did we ever fool ourselves into thinking we were friends?" Sapnap's brows furrowed. "What are you talking about? We're friends." "Is that what you call this?" George snapped. "Is that what you call fighting and screaming and leaving and fighting again? Is that what you call this one-way codependence? I'm not your friend, Sapnap. I'm your fucking parasite." He breathed in, suddenly feeling like he was drowning. "I suppose I should congratulate you." Sapnap's dark eyes were obsidian pits. "What for?" He sounded like he almost pitied him. "You're finally free of me," George said. "Congratulations." Sapnap would have looked less stricken if George had just punched him. "George," he said softly, "I'm sorry." And that was enough to do it. George walked over to him, met his eyes, and actually punched him. It was hard enough to snap Sapnap's head to the side, and when he looked back at George, there was a cut on his lip that spilled blood down his chin. But it wasn't long before the heavy rainfall washed even the blood away. "Well," Sapnap said, "I deserved that, I think." "Yeah, you did," George snapped. "You don't get to say you're sorry, not to me." "I'll say it anyway." "Don't you dare." "George, don't you fucking dare." "I'm sorry." George raised his fist again. Sapnap didn't even flinch. He didn't move to stop him. He just stood there, waiting for a blow that would never come. George's arm fell to his side. Just like that, it was done. He was done. He was tired. So tired. He wanted to sleep. But instead, with a crack in his voice and in his chest, he asked, "Why didn't you take me with you?" Sapnap looked anguished. "I didn't have time. I had to get out of there. I couldn't be there anymore. You have to understand, George, talking to Dream, when I told him I wanted him to leave you alone, when I started arguing with him, it felt like..." He made a frustrated noise, hands working to fill the gaps between his words. "It felt like I was being suffocated, or like I had been suffocating for years and just noticed. I needed air, and I couldn't get enough of it until I was as far away from that house as possible. But why didn't you take me with you?" George growled. "Did you never stop and think that maybe I was suffocating too? Why did you leave me behind? Well, why didn't you follow?" Sapnap shot back. In their silence, they knew they had the same answer to each other's questions. And it was walking up to them in the rain, a small smile on his face. "Lovely reunion," Dream said calmly. "Wouldn't you agree?" "You!" Sapnap snarled, putting himself between George and Dream. Even now, after everything, even as his blood stained George's knuckles. "You have some nerve coming to me now." But Dream wasn't listening. "You ran after George so quickly, you forgot this." He threw Sapnap's sword at him. It clattered at his feet. "Your new friends were more than willing to let me deliver it to you." Sapnap stiffened. Through gritted teeth, Sapnap said, "What did you do to them?" Dream feigned a look of surprise. "Why do you always jump to the worst conclusions, Sapnap?" "When it comes to you, those conclusions are almost always right." He stepped over his own sword, heading towards Dream. "I swear, Dream, if you so much as breathed in their direction..." Dream scoffed. "Put your claws away, little bloodhound. I wouldn't do anything to them." An unsaid word hovered in the air between them. Yet. "At the very least," Dream said, "could you give us an estimate?" Sapnap blinked. "For fucking what?" "For when you finally get bored of playing mortal." Dream cocked his head to the side, staring Sapnap down with bright green eyes. George should have known then. The only animals in the forest with colors that bright were the ones that poisoned you. "You think I'll come running back to you?" Sapnap said, anger lacing every word. "I'll also accept crawling." "You're insane." "No, Sapnap," Dream said evenly. "Insanity would be thinking this won't all fall apart around you. What do you think you're doing here? Do you really think you can love anything without destroying it? Do you think it isn't in our nature to break? And mortals are very breakable, Sapnap." "I think," Sapnap said slowly, "that I fucking hate you right now, Dream." George saw the words land on Dream, and George saw him shrug them off. "You hate me?" Dream asked, walking slowly towards the cliff's edge. "Dream?" George said, but this wasn't his fight. It was Sapnap who stepped forward, his brows furrowed with confusion and conflict. "What are you doing?" Dream was standing at the edge now, the wind and rain slashing against him. But he was immovable, staring at George and Sapnap staring at him. He had his hands behind his back, as if he was just taking a stroll in the sunshine. "You hate me," Dream repeated. Sapnap took a step forwards. "Don't..." Dream fell backwards, and the fear in George's heart eclipsed everything that came before. But Sapnap was there, running towards him and catching Dream by his shirt. And the two of them stood there, Dream suspended over an infinite drop, with Sapnap as his only lifeline. You have a funny way of showing it, Dream said. And then he grabbed Sapnap's wrist, so roughly even George could tell it hurt. He pulled himself back to solid ground, pushing Sapnap back in the process. Sapnap tried wrenching his arm away, but Dream's hold on him was not to be denied. Dream squeezed his wrist, making Sapnap meet his stare. He wasn't smiling anymore. Go ahead, Dream said. You have my permission. Go back to pretending. Live and pretend and love. He leaned in close, until Sapnap had no choice but to see only Dream. Enjoy it while it lasts, but don't blame me when it doesn't. And then he let go. Sapnap stumbled away from him, holding his stare for a second before he snatched his sword from the ground. For a moment, George thought he would run Dream through with it. For a moment, Sapnap looked like he was considering it too. But then he turned around, marching back the way he came. He passed by George, almost as if he had forgotten he was there at all. And then he stopped, turning back, and his eyes were bleak. He looked like he had lost everything, or was about to. George, Sapnap said. Just George. In that single syllable, George heard everything else. Please, and I'm sorry, and come with me. And George almost did. Except he remembered Sapnap's smile around the campfire, and another memory, risen unbidden, of George hanging over a pit, hanging on for dear life. But the memory was different this time. This time, Sapnap stood over him, and Sapnap let him fall. In the end, Dream was right. It was a matter of pride. I'll wait for you at home, George said. Sapnap almost allowed himself to look disappointed, but then that stubbornness returned, making him set his jaw and drag his gaze away from George. He met Dream's eyes evenly. You once said I could survive without you, he said. Watch me prove you right. And then he was gone, leaving George in the downpour. For the first time, George finally registered how cold he was. He fell to the ground, pulling his knees to his chest as if he could somehow warm himself. He began shivering, or maybe he was trembling. Why do I have the feeling that I've just seen him for the last time? He asked brokenly, addressing no one at all. I won't let that happen. He looked up to find Dream standing over him, his green eyes fixed on where Sapnap had disappeared to. Our symphony is still unfinished, George, he said. George shook again, and this time he knew for sure he was trembling. We still have a war to plan. We still have our angel to kill, and we can't do it without Sapnap. A smile flickered on his face, and that was how George knew he already had a plan. If he wants to fight his mortal's war so badly, then I'll let him. I think it'll do our war god good to finally learn what it feels like to lose. George sucked in a shaky breath. What are you going to do? George, Dream sighed, and when he finally looked down to meet George's eyes, George felt like someone had dragged a sharp knife down his spine. Who said I was going to do anything? In a kingdom, there was a castle. In the castle, there was a bedroom. Its occupant did not sleep, but he still dreamed. Often, the dreams were not his own. Often, the dreams were not dreams at all. They were orders from a voice he could not disobey and would not remember in the morning. The forgetting did not absolve him of the crime, but it did absolve him of the shame. In the morning, he could wake up, back in a bed he did not remember sleeping in, and he could go out of his room, down the hallway, down the stairs, down to the garden, and he could meet the prince's eyes without flinching. And he could smile, ignorant, so blissfully ignorant. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, Technoblade dreamed, and he dreamed of blood.